The conversation will be led by Timothy Peterson, who joined MAG last September as the inaugural Anne and Irving Norry Curator of Contemporary Art. That is a brand new position for the museum that was generously funded by Deborah Ronen and is a real game changer for the museum. Tim's prior appointments include director and curator at the Center for Contemporary Art in Maine, director and curator of Franklin Artworks in Minneapolis, and chief curator at SCAD at the Savannah College of Art and Design in Savannah, Georgia. Tim's brought to MAG a wonderfully fresh perspective and has already added some exciting new acquisitions to the collection, some of which you can see in our reconceptualized modern and contemporary art galleries that are just outside the back doors of the auditorium. Sanford Biggers is one of the most important creators of the art of our time. His practice would be so much easier to explain if he weren't such a polymath. He works in many different genres and with many different materials, and most of what he makes defies easy categorization. What's consistent across all of his work is that it contains layered, complex ideas distilled into arresting visual forms. The way he kind of refines and refines and refines an idea reminds me of how sculptors talk about seeing the subject in the stone and taking away material to reveal it. So perhaps he's a sculptor at heart, even when working in other media. Some of the issues he's explored in his work include cultural amnesia, challenging established narratives, rewriting histories, the legacy of slavery, to name just a few. His work offers insights into the most urgent issues of our time and asks us to question our assumptions. That's how he's become one of the most relevant artists working today. He is exhibited all over the world, from the Los Angeles County Museum of Art to the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, Studio Museum in Harlem, Tate Museum, Whitney Museum of American Art. I could go on and on and on. And his work is in the collections of every major museum in this country: Brooklyn Museum, Metropolitan Museum, MoMA, Smithsonian American Art Museum. Again, I can go on and on. He's the recipient of many awards and honors, including the Smithsonian Artist Research Fellowship, Morehouse College's Benny Trailblazer Award, the Guggenheim Fellowship, and he was inducted into the New York Foundation for the Arts Hall of Fame. We are so fortunate to have Oracle, his incredible 9-foot bronze sculpture anchoring the southwest entrance of our Centennial Sculpture Park. And we are thrilled that Sanford is the artist honoree at tonight's MAG Gala, celebrating the art of our time. Please join me in welcoming both Tim and Sanford to the stage.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here. We met earlier this morning, even though I've been following your work for probably 15 years at this moment. And we have a number of images to go through today to talk about your wider practice. Do you want me to dive into a question, or do you want to start with some images?
So, the reason... I want to speak very frankly and casually with you all. One of the reasons that we are even discussing how we will discuss the work is because, as mentioned, I work in a lot of different formats. And I do that intentionally. And we'll get into that throughout the conversation. But I want to make sure we get to the questions and so on. So in my mind, and an ongoing conversation with us is the best way to get through a lot of work to get to our interaction. So I think maybe the best thing is, why don't you start first, and then we'll just sort of build it up.
I have a good general question to begin with, which basically, because you create works in a broad set of media, drawing on influences that include graffiti, American folk tradition, Buddhism, African and European cultural traditions, and of course, the layered history of this country. How would you describe your artistic practice? Or your overall intent behind why you create what you create?
I think the short answer for that is that growing up I was very influenced by encyclopedic museums, much like this. I loved walking through the halls and seeing works from various countries, various continents, various time frames, and especially if there was also contemporary art in those collections as well, because to me that fleshed out the possibilities of creativity and expression throughout human history. And I intentionally started working, I got really interested in art as a child, very young, probably around 10 or 11. Rap music started, at least it got to Los Angeles in my life around 1979, 1980, at which point my father took me and a couple of my friends to see the film Wild Style. It was only at one movie house in Los Angeles. This was the first movie about breakdancing, rap music, and whatever, made by Charlie Ahern from New York City. After that, I got my fat shoelaces, I joined a breakdancing group. I got 2 turntables, and friends and I would switch our turntables, and so I was learning all the hip-hop arts, DJing, MCing, graffiti, and breakdancing. I never was an MC, but I did all the others. And graffiti sort of taught me a way of, expressing myself. It was rebellious too, so it felt like there was some tension in doing it, and then I got busted at some point. And this is, early or mid '80s in Los Angeles, so it was rough out there at that time. And I got the fear of God instilled in me by that experience, and wound up in advanced painting classes at my high school the next week.
Wow.
So I started doing easel painting and oil painting and so on. Huh. And an interesting anecdote, we were all asked to do portraits of our friends and family and people. And I was at a very mixed high school at this point. So we had people from literally everywhere, all over, LA, melting pots, type of thing. And I remember showing my portraits, and the teacher, an older white woman, said, "Why is everybody black in this?" And I laughed. I thought it was a joke. I was like, the assignment was to draw your friends and people around you, so who do you think was around me, And she's like, but I was like, yeah, I have a family that happens to all be black, But the reason I thought it was funny is because maybe she didn't have the foresight of what she was asking, because, the Mexican kids are gonna show who's around him, the Persian kids are gonna find out. That's what you're gonna get, it's LA, right? But I realized at that point that the artwork and the author of the artwork sometimes can inform how that work is perceived. So I have consciously worked in several mediums to always confuse and basically be fugitive in terms of being labeled as one specific type of artist, working one specific genre, and working in one tonality. So I work in many different forms as a way of subverting all of those labels, but also to inspire, once again, back to me being inspired by these museums, is to inspire other creatives, especially creatives of color, not to self-pigeonhole themselves, because the world is more than happy to pigeonhole you. So this is really about expressive liberation.
Wow. I deeply appreciate all of that. I lived in 1979, but you would not want to see me dance. So, it would be great since we just talked about hip hop to talk about this image that is behind us and in front of us.
Sure. This was a project that I did coming right out of grad school. I went to the Art Institute of Chicago, and I finished in 1999, at which point I was invited to New York to be a resident artist at the Studio Museum in Harlem and at PS1. And I did separate bodies of work for both of those situations, but this was a specific work that I did, and I should preface this. I'd lived in Japan for 3 years prior to going to grad school, and I was deeply influenced by Buddhism. And I wanted to find a way to weave my Buddhist experience into my hip-hop experience to create an autobiographical work that was not representative, at least figuratively representative of myself. So what I've done here, what you're looking at, is the dance floor. That was the sculpture that I did. Once again, back into this fugitive notion, I was not interested in doing sculptures that sat on pedestals. I wanted to get rid of the pedestal. I wanted the sculptures to be living objects that you can interact with, or you can revere and stand away. And this served both purposes. I made this, linoleum-cut mandala, influenced by Buddhism and my time in Japan. And then I took it to breakdancing competitions ultimately throughout the world, but it started in the Bronx. So what you're seeing is the floor, a performance with all these different breakdancers of all ages standing around it, and then an overhead view looking down on the floor as the dancers perform.
I love that aerial view. It really changes your perspective of basically handstands and spinning. And
Well, back to this, the way my mind works, I was thinking about that, but I was also thinking about Busby Berkeley films. And for those who don't know, who are of certain generations, Busby Berkeley was a filmmaker in the golden age of Hollywood who was doing these extremely complicated choreographed scenes that were usually filmed from above, where you had multiple dancers, male and female, doing choreographed motions that ended up looking like kaleidoscopic effects after it was fully edited. So that was a way of bringing that influence into the work. But also Buddhists making the mandala, which is a circular diagram. Mm-hmm. And in my studying and meditating with monks, I learned that sometimes they don't even draw the circles. They just sometimes move around in circular movement. And that creates the mandala.
Beautiful.
And if you think of Haitian art, they have veves on the ground that sometimes have circular motion. In India, there are sand drawings outside of people's homes. This is a world tradition of working from an aerial perspective to create a motif on the ground that serves as a way to transcend earthly existence.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. Before there's flight, people imagining an aerial view, but all the way up to the present. I'm amazed that that wonderful linoleum work traveled with you. Did that roll up, or did that come apart?
No, that was okay. So back in the day when we used to literally do this on the street, we used to roll the linoleum up and carry it, and then just roll it out.
Yeah.
For that, I made it. It's a 20-foot by 20-foot square, so I made it in panels, and these panels have to be shipped, but in these very thin crates that I developed. And that particular work has gone to Japan, it's gone to the UK, it's gone to France, Germany, California.
Wow.
And when it's displayed, it's usually just the floor. So it's almost like a Carl Andre piece. It's a floor sculpture, and you can actually walk on it, and when you do, you start to see the scuff marks, and that's your first hint that something happened. So this goes back to the ethnographic museum, where you see an object that was taken from a culture, put into, on a pedestal and in a vitrine, and now people say, oh, it's art. But actually, it was an object that was used for something. It was a tool, or it might have been a spiritual device, but whatever it was, it had contact with people. This floor obviously got its scuff marks from that contact, and now it's up for the viewer to decipher some of that information.
Oh, it's a beautiful way to look at it, especially in 2000, from somebody who was curating way back then.
Yeah. Well, these works were nightmares for curators. I mean, this piece right here is all sand. That's poured sand directly on the ground. So if you sneeze.
And did you do the pouring?
Yes, for this particular one, this one is 20 feet by 40 feet, so it's massive. It's wall to wall in here. And I worked with a team of probably 5 people, and I taught them the way that I poured sand, because I did probably 6 or 7 pieces leading up to this one. Mm-hmm. And this particular one, I usually would do graffiti, New York style graffiti in sand, but this one I did a prayer rug. This was a bit after 9/11, and of course there was a lot of anti-Islamic sentiment in the US, and I want to show something of the beauty of the culture. And this is based off of 6th century Afghani prayer rug. And it was done in sand, and then at the end of the exhibition, swept up, and then put into a body of water in the Buddhist ceremonial way.
It's fascinating. I mean, that you also drew around those pillars.
Well, I like to play with the architecture.
Yeah.
And, as an artist, once again, when I started to work off of the pedestal, I had to take into account architecture, because architecture then became the frame, the pedestal, the canvas. So doing work like that allows me to break down the architecture and integrate it, as opposed to be bordered or bounded by it.
That must give you a lot of, I mean, that removes limitation, and traditional forms of limitation. Wow, I love that. Sorry, I have my written questions here. And forgive me if this question is too simplistic, but it's just, you've described yourself as an artistic intermediary. What drives your work examining and reinterpreting, and how do you see yourself as an intermediary?
I take some notes from Marcel Duchamp and the idea of the ready-made, which revolutionized contemporary art when that first happened at the turn of last century. And the idea was taking, you may know his famous stool with the bicycle wheel on it, or the Armut urinal piece. These pieces shocked the world because they were literally everyday objects that were now elevated or denigrated into art at that time. And it changed the way people perceived art and what it could do. We take that for granted now. That was shocking back then. But I thought there was a very important thing that happened there, because also looking at indigenous art forms from all around the world, there's the idea of taking something that exists that already has some power in it, and then rearranging it and turning it into a device or tool to educate and inform and to serve deference to. So
You're really thinking from every direction.
yeah, I mean, so this is why I call myself an intermediary.
Yeah.
The work has already been done in the world. These thoughts are out there. I am just one conduit of compiling some of that information and finding a way to put it into forms that we could all look at. There's many other people that do that. But I am an intermediary for that signal that I'm getting to try to put back.
You're embracing and disrupting the continuum.
There you go. Well said.
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah.
As artists bring new ideas into the world, I like that, but build on what many points of inspiration. That I like how you embrace what existed before. I'd love to talk about Blossom, this piece at the Brooklyn Museum, which speaks a great deal to American history, as well as to we were talking briefly about the music component of this, which is fascinating.
Well, I learned once again when I was a kid in that high school where I was questioned like, why are all the portraits black? I realized I also was drawing on my clothes at the time. I was doing graffiti. I was doing graffiti art on my clothes. I was doing other people's jackets and stuff. And as I was doing that, I started to do portraits of like Mahalia Jackson or Sojourner Truth or Miles Davis or Gandhi. And at that time, high school, junior high school, people were like, who's that? Who's that? And I was able to talk to them about these figures. And I was like, oh, there's an educational component. There's a transference of information here that is only provoked by the art itself. Yeah. So I started to use my work, and going back to the mandala and going back to everything we looked at, the power object. Power objects, the Venus of Willendorf, these are all power objects. They've been around through all eternity. Why not make artwork that becomes a power object itself? So this piece, Blossom, was made with that in mind. And this was my reaction to the Gina 6 incident that happened in Louisiana. I think it was around 2007 or 2008, where there was some racial skirmishes that happened around a high school in Gina, Louisiana, amongst black kids and white kids. It started, I think, one day there was a black kid who wanted to go sit under the tree where a bunch of the popular white kids sat. And the teacher was like, he asked the teacher if he could do it. The teacher was like, of course, why would you ask? Go sit down. The kid went and sat down. Gradually, the white kids left. And then a day or two later, there were nooses hanging from that tree. Okay. I mean, this is the news. I'm not making this up. This happened, And I was shocked by it, and I was like, wow, here we are in 2007 having the same conversation from 1907. And we're not even talking about contemporary times here, because you guys get the metaphors. So I made this work in response to that, and I used the piano, because myself, I'm a musician as well. I play piano. And I programmed the piano to move. I retrofitted this thing, so the keys move, and they play my version of Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit. So that's the audio that you hear in the back. And the tree is made out of resin and metal, and it breaks down into several pieces. And the piano is attached to it, and it's quiet until someone walks in the room, and then the piano starts moving.
How does this artwork, I'm sorry to use the word know someone has entered the room?
There's a sensor underneath, a motion sensor, basic hardware store motion sensor that triggers the mechanism to start the performance.
So you've created a moment for people to basically be in interaction with this work and to confront their interaction with these subjects.
Well, I don't think an artwork is complete without the viewer.
I agree.
And I don't work in a vacuum, and once I make it, think that it's done.
Yeah.
The phrase I like to use, or the word I like to use, is the work has to be charged. And the work gets charged by viewers interacting with it. And I try to make work that is seductive. I'll be very frank about that. Formal beauty and seduction is very key to the work, but that's just the surface. And beyond that, the journey gets a lot deeper, and it goes into different, versions of history and so on, of art and culture.
For anyone in the audience who doesn't know Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, I'd print out some lyrics, but it's a seminal song that discusses the subject that you are embracing in this piece, and it's you playing the piano. Is also the layers of your thought within this piece is actually quite fascinating as well. If I can find it here, I'm not the person, unless you'd rather encapsulate Strange Fruit.
I'm sure someone in the audience knows the words offhand. Who knows the words of Strange Fruit offhand? Could you recite maybe just a verse or a little bit of it, if you can, if you're not too shy?
Oh, there's another hand.
And blood roots. And then the refrain is black bodies hanging in the southern breeze.
Strange fruit hanging in the poplar trees.
Strange fruit hanging in the poplar trees. But this is part of the American Classic Songbook. And it was written not just by Billie Holiday, but Abe Mirpool, a Jewish writer, composer, who made a couple of hits on Tin Pan Alley and then turned political because of the things he saw happening in the US and could not get a song made until Billie Holiday heard his version of Strange Fruit and said, that's my song. So there's a history of collaboration even to make that song that has been attributed to the civil rights movement and all this other stuff. This is what I talk about when I talk about the complexities of history. It's never one story, it's several stories.
What was I'm sorry, I can't remember what the tree is made of. Is that an actual tree?
No, so that's a resin compound, a metal armature, silk leaves. It breaks into a couple of different pieces, and then an actual, baby grand piano.
The actual baby grand piano. Wow. Anyway, we just skipped past a piece.
I'm moving because I know we have a lot.
We have some time. Yeah.
We haven't even scratched the surface.
Well, I'd love to get into your quilt work,
Okay.
which we tried to lend a piece, but it's in great demand.
I'll bring you to that one.
This piece with crows, and Rochester does have a history with crows, so they pass through here. This is, I've been told this. I've been here 7 months. I don't have my own experience to draw from, but
I actually saw one when you were introducing me. That's why I was looking out of the roof of the skylight. There was one that was perched on the building right across the way.
This one is actually in the collection of Crystal Bridges, art bridges. It's about 12 feet long as well. How are you hand sewing these works?
Actually, I don't hand sew the original quilts. I did hand sew these 2 quilts to put them together. to make them that long.
Okay.
I am a provisional sewer at best. I leave that up to the professionals. But back to the notion of the ready-made, I'm specifically using antique quilts. Some of them are in disrepair, so then my job, or the job between me and my studio team, is to sometimes repair them, and then I do the artwork on them. So I add other pieces of older quilts. I add kimono fabric that I still get from Japan regularly.
Wow.
I draw on them. I use oil stick, paint, tar, glitter, you name it.
And the patterns that show up specifically in this piece, is where are you creating or sourcing those from?
So this particular one is actually my version of a Hiroshige Japanese woodblock print. It's a figure in the background of one of the prints. And I just like the gesture of how the body is hanging. And I want to make it very abstract. It's figurative, but very abstract. So you can't pinpoint where the limbs and face or any of that are, but you get the sense of a figure or a spirit or a cloaked individual in the center there. And, working on these quilts is very difficult. It goes back to my childhood doing graffiti. So part of it is the rebel in me saying, I'm going to deface this. But part of that is the Buddhist in me saying, I'm going to beautify this and repair this. And therein lies the tension. The tension is this desecration or is this beautification? And this conversation transcends culture as well. You remember when you started to hear sampled music and they're like, oh, I know the original song, but no one else remembered the original song. So that original song got brought back into the dialogue through the sample. So I'm bringing back these older quilts back into the dialogue by adding a contemporary, contemporary input to it. But let's remember, a quilt by nature is a sampled fabric.
Yes.
So its whole history is patchwork.
It's fascinating this touches on memory as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Bodily memory, psychic memory, cultural memory.
Cultural memory too. I lost the question I had about this. Hiroshige worked in ukiyo-e woodblock printing.
Yes.
So you were transposing this giant quilt from.
Hold on, sorry. Let me get back to you. I'm sorry. What's going on here?
I wasn't looking at the monitor.
Oh,
sorry.
there you go.
We do have a lot to go through. So.
We have a lot to go through.
Well, we can move to
there.
there.
There we go.
Yeah, that is a great one. No, it's fascinating that this work that is 82, nearly 82 inches square comes from partial inspiration for this comes from a small, but iconic woodblock from Japan, from an artist from Japan from the late 19th century. Yeah.
Well, I lived in Japan for 3 years.
Yes.
So, that's what I was looking at when I was there. And the way those pieces are made, it's a very complicated, masterful way of painting. But once it's mastered, it's actually very fast and all about gesture and movement. And it's the distillation of years of experimentation to get to the point where the expression could literally be done in 2 or 3 strokes. To me, that is amazing. And that's something I strive for even in my work. As I get deeper and deeper into this complicated stuff, I'm like, how can I make this really about a gesture or a stroke or two? How can I consolidate all that information?
Wow. Because the resulting
this is how it works up
pieces,
here. I don't know. I can't make sense of it. This is how
your
it works.
resulting works have great power, and it's fascinating to think that comes through partially through an act of reduction.
It's all about reduction.
Yeah.
So I used to teach, I taught for several years, over almost 2 decades. College level art courses, I taught at VCU, taught at Columbia for 9 years, taught at Harvard, taught at MIT, and Cooper Union. That was the earlier part of my career before I started really working with commercial galleries. And I would always tell my students that the masterstroke really is about reduction. The masterstroke is not all the tricks in your bag, it's about the one trick in your bag. But it takes those years to figure that out.
Wow. Sorry, I'm standing in for you saying wow. So maybe, is there anything else? Before we move on to the Chimera series, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts of any of these specific quilts.
Sure. Rather than speak about the specific ones, I will say that I started the quilts on a 2-dimensional level, as you're seeing, paintings, drawings directly on repurposed quilts. Then gradually I started to push the perspective that happens in those pattern quilts into sculptural pieces like this, where I started to form and shape the quilts to make them do things that they don't do in reality.
Yeah.
But that was a way to play with the optical retinal vibration that can happen when you have repetitive pattern. So this star right here becomes very psychedelic once you put that wave in there. Now, how that wave happens and the fact that it could stand static on the wall, that's the masterstroke. I don't reveal those secrets.
I was going to ask you about that.
But let's put it this way, it doesn't happen overnight. So even this one right here, this is a shaped canvas. I cut the edges to give it an odd shape. I show it as a diamond as opposed to a square. And those white spaces are literally cut through the entire thing, but the drop shadow is drawn onto the quilt. So it's an impossibility. These are like visual conundrums. This couldn't happen in reality. But we're suspending our reality when we look at art, and I'm taking advantage of that by doing this.
Also taking advantage of the white cube of a gallery. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then later that becomes freestanding three-dimensional pieces. So this one is actually a wooden armature and then quilts cut up and pastiched around the entire piece. And I'm going to zoom past that because I've done large-scale works that are outdoor permanent pieces that follow this format that are done in tile and corian and other weather-sustainable materials.
Wow. I love these works that suspend on the walls and actually take on corners as well, or require architecture
Yeah.
for their installation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's also a way to blur the line between, strictly a wall-based art, but also dealing with the architecture and design and the totality of the space. This was sort of my way of figuring out how to work within the white cube, to your point. Because prior to that, I was really more into raw spaces and places that I could play off of a certain environment. And the white cube is a way that was decided, years ago to eradicate any interference for the work.
Yeah.
Which to me is deafening. The silence is deafening. So I had to find ways of dealing with that. And I prefer the raw spaces, coming from a graffiti background.
Yeah. Wow. These installation shots are stunning. I'm fascinated by your installation code switch. And I wasn't aware, my whole life, I've been code switching until about 4 or 5 years ago. But it's a fascinating practice of adapting your behavior or your dress or your voice or any aspect of yourself to fit into a less forgiving majority culture.
Absolutely, well said.
Yeah.
Perfect, yeah.
And this is the title for the installation, but it incorporates many individual pieces. That's a fascinating concept for me to address all of these from the perspective of, in a way, of adaptation or change.
Yes. Yeah, well, we call it code switch because there's a backstory connected to quilts frequently, that certain types of quilts and certain patterns were used as signposts on the Underground Railroad. So as escaping enslaved people were trying to move from the South to the North to freedom, preferably Philadelphia, New York, and further north to Canada. As they're traveling at night, they'd come to a house and see a quilt of a certain pattern or maybe folded a certain way or located in a strategic location that would tell them, okay, keep moving, or this is a safe house and it's open, or this is a safe house under surveillance, keep moving. So there was coded messages within the quilts. Historians have debated this for years. Some believe it happened. A lot say that it didn't. I took the stance that if the codes were any good, then there's no reason anyone should be able to decipher them now. So now I become a late contributor to these quilts, these codes. So the notion of code switch was what codes do then I put on to these existing codes, and is it about reading it now or reading this in the future? So I've really, back to one of your first questions, I've started to talk about my work as basically objects for future ethnography. So that the deciphering of all of this practice, oracle, quilts, the Chimera that we'll go into, is not really about us reading it today, but about how whatever culture system comes after us looks at these objects and tries to make sense of the world that we live in right now.
Wow, which your work tackles in so many dimensions. That's fascinating to then encode it.
Contemporary art, traditional art, it's all encoded.
I agree, but I'm talking about the specific way you're doing it is fascinating. I've never had the opportunity to see this work.
Yes.
Bam, and this the scale in sculpture. When did your scale go up in sculptural work?
So let's see. Honestly, I started working large scale, I'd say, in the late 90s, but none of that work was ever displayed. This was me in grad school trying to, figure out what I was going to do. And I started welding, doing very large pieces, and I did what I called guerrilla monuments. Like I did a huge 13-foot figure made out of metal for Tupac Shakur after he was killed, and I put it in a vacant lot in Baltimore where he used to live.
Wow.
And at night, and it lasted for a couple of weeks before somebody removed it. You remember, I come from graffiti, so this was not a strange thing to do back then.
Yeah.
And I was avoiding the direct engagement with the figure for many, many years until the propensity of us seeing all the videos of people getting killed by, the police. So I was living in Germany at the time, and every other morning I'm waking up seeing, on my phone videos of someone getting killed. And I didn't know what to do, and I had a very visceral reaction, and I started to take all these African objects that I had been collecting for many years and saying, I'm going to sacrifice these objects to make a body of work. Wow. And so what you see on the right side is one of the objects that I had, and I took it and I encrusted it in a wax, so it got rid of all the facial features, all the detail. And I did this with around 15 other pieces. I would first dip them in wax, and then I would take them to a shooting range, and I would sculpt them with guns. I would sculpt them with 9mm, with 12-gauge shotguns, and you name it, different caliber weapons, and you can see the different marks that the different bullets would make. And then I would make a high-speed video, so you'd literally see a slowed down bullet go in and just very difficult, very violent, visceral work. But it wasn't about the work, it was about what I was commenting on, so it had to be that way. I would take then the remnants of those pieces, cast them in bronze, and then show that as an artwork. So the figure on the left, it was what remained after the piece on the right. And I did blow that one up. That one was 9 feet tall. Most of them are literally the same size as the original object.
Oh, really?
So that was a blown up version of it. But yes, so.
I find part of the beauty of this piece in the fact that you have to look up to it.
Well, this one is great, and this one literally lives at the Equal Justice Initiative Museum in down south with, why am I forgetting my names right now? With Brian Stevenson, for sure, the legendary Brian Stevenson. And he handpicked this work to be at the end of the interior exhibition talking about from, slavery to mass incarceration and so on. So
Yeah.
as you're leaving, this is sort of the end note, seeing this monument that's called for Michael Brown. So I named every one of these pieces after a victim. And you can see there are several made. After 15 or so of them, I had to stop because I could spend the rest of my career doing this type of work, which is a testimony in and of itself. So
To culture and inherent
and there were
bias.
videos that went with that, but we could talk about that a little later. But that leads us up to the chimeras, actually.
It's fascinating that that's the path, that is part of the path to chimeras.
It was such difficult work, and it was soul draining to do that work. And I was like, now that I was dealing with the figure, and I was dealing with the figure in bronze, the academic in me was like, okay, well, let's go through the classic route of figuration, from wood to bronze to stone, and that started this journey. So at this point, I had moved to Rome to do the American Academy in Rome. This was 2017, and I was surrounded by marble ruins, and I was like, I've never seen African forms in marble. What would that look like? It was just, a query. And then I was like, oh, but what if I took the ruins and, started mixing the limbs? And, you could look at these Roman ruins as violence, but we don't. We revere them as classic. But here we have black bodies that are cut and shred and torn and violence, and doesn't have that same type of cultural gravitas for some reason.
No,
what happens when you represent that in stone? So that's really how it started.
And the ancient sculptures, and all the wear damage that happens to it, it's like, oh, that's time. This piece stands up to time.
Exactly.
Rather than your comment on the time we actually are in.
Exactly.
It's beautiful. And for just to posit us as we move into this next section, Oracle, standing at the western entry to Memorial Art Gallery Sculpture Park, belongs within the Chimera series.
Yes.
And I believe was the first work you cast in bronze from this series?
Yes.
Okay.
So, and
just
so
got-
far,
just-
the largest bronzes that I've done have been with Oracle.
I want to get to the bronzes in a minute, but the start is fascinating for me in that I'm fascinated on this merging of forms. You're looking, I mean, on some level, you're sourcing globally for these works, but particularly Greco-Roman and African forms show up a great deal in this. And it's not to, and you're creating a new figure out of this rather than, even though you can see that there's a mask form here, if you walk to the back side of this, the mask is now part of the figure. Yes. And I'm fascinated by how you, well, the marble is a fascinating subject because, you know, with Greece and Rome, we're equating marble to skin color. And in this case, you're creating something that is different and incorporates more, a wider sense of the history of sculpture and the representation of the figure.
Well, I think one of the, there's so many interesting stories about these marbles is that we know them currently as monochromatic marbles. But when they were in Rome and Greece at the time, they were painted.
Yes.
And they were painted to show really the wealth of the nation. The fact that they can get gold leaf or they can get indigo or they can get these colors was really a flex, showing their power and wealth. And another piece of that irony, so the white ones were obviously painted in all these colors, so they, you know, would have uniforms on. All that was resplendent with color. And you can imagine how overwhelming that must have been to see that at that scale at that time. Of course, the color wears off over time because they had no way of preserving that part. But interestingly, they started doing pieces that would represent foreigners and barbarians. And for that, they'd get colored marble, colored stone. So they'd get colored stone to represent people that they would ultimately denigrate. And then they would use the white stone to represent the native Romans and Grecians. The rub there is that the white stone was the most easy to get, basically cheapest in the neighborhood stuff. Whereas the colored stone, they'd have to literally import from someplace, so they paid a premium to then represent somebody that they wanted to denigrate, which I find super interesting. But I think there was a corollary to that when you talk about African sculpture, because African sculpture too also had pigments, it had raffia, it had beads, embellishment. It wasn't just black or brown piece of wood. And that notion, the way we see it as these modernist objects, comes from Europeans, particularly at the turn of the 20th century, trying to represent African sculptures in print. And it was too expensive to try to do color representation of all of that. So they're like, just take the raffia off, just get rid of some of the color, and now it's a monochromatic brown, black sculpture, which is, lovely. But that aesthetic was basically an appropriation and an editing job in the print house to say, this is our easiest way of representing this, but that influenced all the modernists. So when you start to see the influx of African form in those works of Picasso and Brancusi and all these people, is because they're getting these denuded versions of the African sculptures. So you have these being whitewashed, and then you have the African works being blackwashed. And these are two things that are happening in different parts of the world as a way of how we now perceive those objects. To me, that's just totally fascinating.
And national identity is tied up in these as well.
Propaganda, it gets usurped.
What you choose to celebrate or denigrate in terms of defining yourself or your culture.
And beauty and power.
In some kind of hierarchy. Wow. With all of that point of inspiration, as a contemporary curator, my knowledge comes into all the modern artists Picasso and others who were influenced by finally being exposed to the physical sculptures and not their reproductions. I'm fascinated how, and I love the title Chimera, which I used to know the definition of, and I can't really, but it's really a mercurial form.
Yeah, it's sort of a shape-shifting mercurial. There is a specific chimera that I think, correct me, anyone in the audience, if they know what the original combination of animals supposedly went into making a chimera, that over the years, the name has come to mean a form that can take many different shapes.
Perhaps
change.
the Sphinx or
Yep, like a
with-
sphinx or a griffin,
yeah.
or a minotaur, or these combine animals.
And so mythology comes into this work as well. And but when you're creating a form such as this one, called The Wiser Fool, which is a great title, carved in an absolutely beautiful greenish shade of marble, how are you carving these?
Okay, so this is a combination of scanning, I developed a side hustle many years ago of scanning objects in museums, largely for museums to then move their collection online. I started this right before the pandemic. Obviously, it went really well during the pandemic as everyone was trying to put their stuff online. But it also gave me a way to partially get paid in those scans. So now I have material to use. And I morph all of these objects, so they're very rarely the original form they come in, especially the masks. I don't want the masks to be attributed to one specific culture within Africa. I like to mix them together to create a hybrid new form. And the poses that you see on the Roman or the European counterparts are very archetypal. And if you don't know the history of those objects, a lot of the Roman sculptures were originally Grecian sculptures. So the Romans took those sculptures from the Greeks and said, okay, we're going to do it in bronze, we're going to do it in these other materials. So they started sampling work from the Greeks. And then throughout art history, every student who works in sculpture has to then use these models to learn how to do the form. So they are now sampling the Roman ones. And then everyone embellishes and does their thing. So you have the great American sculptors going to Paris and France and working there, and they're going through this whole art anthology of sculptural objects. So patchwork is happening in the quilts. Patchwork is happening in the stone.
It's funny, it's obvious and right in front of me, but I didn't align the idea of patchwork to both of these.
And I included this image. This is a very, very early work, 2001, because we often talk about my chimeras as new and African and European, but I started doing chimeras back in the early 2000s when I came back from Japan. And this one's in motion. I don't have one without motion, but what you're seeing is a clear cast Buddha figure that has fat shoelaces wrapped around it to create its robe. And spinning around it are 4 other clear cast Buddhas that have like fat gold chains and medallions and all these trinkets from around the world that represent American culture and Black culture, but they're usually made in China. And the Buddha form that I made the mold from was made in Mexico. So all this patchwork and all this international commercial interplay has been happening since Constantinople, since Egypt. This is just how we get down, So I'm just taking all of that and putting it back into a form that is a bit more contemporary.
It's funny how the simpler understanding of history is revealing itself as far more complex and interconnected than we ever knew it was because we're looking for it.
Right. And I think it's in human nature, and over time, the idea of trying to crystallize and minimize the story to try to rewrite the narrative. But the narrative will always come back up because we are too embedded in this system together. The world, all of us, have been too embedded for too many millennium to extricate those parts.
And like the artwork you're wondering if it will be in the codes you will hope the future will understand. It's we have to trust that people will have inquiring minds.
Yes, well, this is
and see some connection to where they are.
Yeah, hope so. I mean, that's why I say one of my missions is to fight historic and cultural amnesia. These objects, if they are power objects, they retain some of the narrative.
This is very needed. I've been given the signal that we got about 5 minutes left, so maybe we should jump to actual Oracle. Because actually, a number of things you've been discussing really, sorry, we're jumping past all these works. I love your cloud installation. This looks a lot like our ballroom, and it's making me dream of your clouds in there. But Oracle is an amalgamation of some, actually one of the lost ancient wonders of the world, the statue of Zeus at Olympus, again, only known to us through copies, and a mask with a hairpiece on the back that come from at least 2 cultures. This is really me setting setting you up to tell me about that.
Sure. Sure. So what he's talking about, the body comes from a depiction, a rendering of what historians say was a copy of the statue, the largest statue ever made at the time. This was somewhere like 400 BC, at Mount Olympia, of Zeus seated in his throne. And it only exists through people writing about it at the time, and then later historians drawing from those writings. So we've never seen this actual thing, but from those writings throughout history, people have tried to then render that object. So if you go online to see the sculpture of Zeus, you'll see some that are seated like this. You'll see another that has a leg out and the robe is off of the knee. You see different samples of the same story. So I took this particular form, and then the mask is a combination. This specific one is Chokwe, Luba, and Masai, all sort of combined to make this, this face. And I wanted to use a face like this because you wouldn't necessarily assume it was an African sculpture. It's not the typical form that you would see in a museum. So it adds a little mystery to it. And the original Zeus is depicted with a staff and an eagle. This one has a torch, because the first one, the original oracle, was this one, at Rockefeller Center, which is around 25, close to 30 feet tall. So it's massive. By far the largest bronze piece I've ever done. And because it was New York City, I wanted to include a torch about liberty, right? And it actually works, the light comes out and so on. And for the one here, of course, we scaled down to 9 feet. And there are all these details around the piece that evoke other works of mine, particularly here. The pointer doesn't work on this, but on the far right panel, you see those circles going around the throne of Zeus. That's derived from a piece I did years ago at the same time I did that piano tree piece called Lotus. And this is, coming out of sort of my Buddhist influence as well. This is a large mandala, a lotus blossom. But when you get closer, you realize that the petals of that lotus are actually slave ships. And these come from old slaving manuals of how to best pack human cargo to maximize your profit when bringing bodies from Africa to the Americas. Now, interesting, I found out recently that these slaving manuals and these depictions actually really differ from the reality, because they were nowhere near this organized. And they would throw bodies in on top of each other and people would die, and the stories of the passage. It was not this IKEA version per se. But so anyway, I made that piece, the original glass piece. And this is a large glass work. You could tell it's very large.
Beautiful.
Made that in 2007, knowing that I wanted to keep using that as an icon, but gradually get rid of the bodies, so that it literally transcends the history and becomes a blossom, a flower. And that's where it has transcended right there, because now it's at the center of commerce, basically, at Rockefeller Center, around Zeus. And the reason I'm into mythology and all of these references, specifically when I did this at Rock Center, was because already at Rockefeller Center, as many of you know, there's depictions there already of Zeus, Prometheus, Apollo, Nereids, Atlas, Tritons. Greek mythology is embedded throughout the campus. So this was the new addition to that.
And this was the centerpiece of a massive installation.
Yes.
I love the flags that you took on as well.
I don't even have pictures of it. I did so many more installations around the whole complex, and I also made a playlist that was playing through the entire time.
Wow. The one question I want to ask before we go to Q&A is this sculpture. Well, in the series of your Oracle work, there has been a history of them being installed at the entrances of cultural sites. Recently on view, the first sculpture on view at the sculpture platform outside the Hammer Museum in Los Angeles, Rockefeller Center, the western entrance of our sculpture garden. Of course, it's been installed elsewhere as well, like in the woods and in Las Vegas and elsewhere. But how do you feel about the sculpture serving as an entry point?
Well, I mean, to me, it's the intent of my work. I mentioned, I've already referenced power objects. And power objects have existed throughout history. And Oracle, as we all know, oracles in the past, like the Oracle of Delphi and all those different places, are these enigmatic figures, mostly women, probably 100% women. All oracle were women. I don't know if people know that.
Yeah.
They were usually not seen, but people would literally make pilgrimages to go speak to the oracle and ask the oracle questions. And the oracle will give you an answer that could be super abstract, super enigmatic. They might even just laugh at you. But the point is, you have to take that and figure out what it means. So this as an oracle is a power object. It's about power object. And for it to be at the entrance, it serves this purpose, that you are entering a certain space. And this object, this oracle, is here for you to commune with. It welcomes you, it's your guardian, it's your guide, and as you walk in, you receive the blessing from it. The interesting one is this one here at Vegas. This is a 5-foot Vegas. 5'1" at the Aria in Vegas, or the Bellagio. If you're walking into this now, this is right when it was installed, you could tell because there's nobody in the shot. If you go there now, there's areas on it that have rubbed, totally shiny because everyone goes in and rubs it. But you'll see this all over the world at certain type of objects. People go and they touch it for good luck.
Yes.
I'm totally okay with it. That's what it's for. And there's usually money and stuff all around it because people leave offerings to it. And
Wow.
I did not direct that. I wanted that. I did not direct that. So it has taken on the life of a true oracle.
Thank you. I've loved every minute of this conversation, but at this point we need to, for time, turn this over to any questions that folks have. And Chio we have one person with a mic through the audience, so first question here.
Hi, delightful work. It's really exciting to see how the idea of chimeras, not only in your current body of work is relevant, but how it has been a part of your larger body of work. You asked earlier, lions, snake, and goat, I believe. But I wanted to ask you specifically about your transition from teaching into gallery spaces and ask about what that experience was like for you over time.
Challenging. It's a different hat. I moved back full-time to New York to teach at Columbia in 2009. And I was basically part-time in New York all the way up to that because I was teaching in other states. So when I took the post at Columbia, I was full faculty there for several years, teaching grad and undergrad. And, in my life, I'd say now that my superpower back then was I didn't need to sleep. So I would do my day of teaching and then go to the studio and put in a full 8 hours in the studio all the time. Sleep was not a priority. So I was able to have one foot in the academy and another foot into the art world. But my focus then, honestly, was really doing shows, group shows, museum shows, institution shows, hanging out with artists and so on. I was not totally engaged with the commercial art scene yet, but it was a necessary transition because I realized as much fun and as great as it was working in this way, that I still needed to expand the audience. And there was a way to expand the audience and make it part of the contemporary art dialogue by then, through the help and working with commercial galleries, getting introduced to that sort of collector group, that collector base, which is, there's lots of different collector bases. And that was one that was lacking. And it was good to start to be introduced to that, to fulfill, I guess, the mission of this work being seen by all the right people and as many people as possible.
Thank you. Any other question at the back? There we go.
You mentioned at Rockefeller Center you had a playlist.
Oh, yeah.
I'd like to know what was on it.
You guys could actually get it on your phone. I believe it's still open. It's on Spotify, and it's called it's either We Are Oracle or We Are the Oracle. I think it might be We Are Oracle. I mentioned that I'm a musician as well. I have a band. I just won a Grammy last year. So music is very important to my practice, and the music on that set list will make a lot of sense to you. It's a journey. It's definitely a journey. It goes all the way from The Police to Radiohead to Alice Coltrane to Sun Ra, you name it. It's all there.
There's a question in the back row.
Yes, I, for one, appreciate your thought process and how you approach your work. One thing I am curious is, outside of your lived experiences, what about your work in particular comes how can I word this? What aspects of yourself is built into your work outside of your lived experiences, if I,
That's a great question. I've literally been thinking about that a lot this week. Like this week specifically. I don't know why, but I sort of got on that page like, am I in this work? How am I in this work? And, I think we have many different parts of our personality. And different series of my work touch on different aspects of my personality. At the end of the day, I think the process to making the work is literally my blood and guts. It's countless hours, it's lifetimes of research and experimentation and failure and anxiety and fear and triumph and all of that. And if it doesn't have some of that, then it's not a work for me. I don't phone anything in, probably to my detriment. But I feel that intent is very important, especially when you're dealing with conceptual work that purposefully does not depict me. Because the story is it's not necessarily about me as the individual. It is about the process. It's definitely about the process. And I look at that in a very Buddhist metaphor, is that we are as we live. So, the body changes multiple times a day. As we're shedding, we're growing, we're doing all that stuff all the time. The psyche does the same. I think the work represents that in terms of evolving.
Oh, question. Oh, sorry. There's also one in the back.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm raising my hand because I want to respond to that, because I've been sitting here. I think it's an interesting response to that question, because I'll say at the very beginning, it's been very refreshing to hear people be challenged in how they identify you in terms of your work. And sitting here thinking, and with your generosity and offering us so much insight into your process, I'm someone and also very familiar with your work, but I've never really had the opportunity to hear you speak so deeply about it. And so I've been sitting here thinking about how this work moves with you and how the work that you are making actually does, in my interpretation, in my experience, in my observation, comes from you. I've been thinking about time and how you identify as a conduit. This future ethnography that you're trying to, it seems like you're in a place where you're trying to define yourself. All that being said, I am interested in perhaps the challenge of being an artist who moves in such an non-definable way. But I also want to offer that I think that lack of definition makes sense to me because it comes from where you are. So especially with Oracle, it makes a lot of sense that it would have this Greco-Roman reference because it came from the place where you are, what your faith is, your surroundings. And so I think that's something that's really important to hear, how you contextualize yourself and how you pull from your surroundings to make these works or to serve as inspirations for these works. So my question is about the challenge, but also to respond that I see you at the core of the work very clearly. So, yeah.
Well, that show was called the show with the quilt was called Code Switch. And to some degree, everyone in this audience has done some code switching. It's just a matter of navigating through society. And I think I've been very blessed to be able to chronicle some of those shifts and some of those hats and some of those personas, and I make them very tangible and permanent throughout the work. Even if they shift over time, that was a part of myself when I was living in Rome versus the part when I was living in Japan versus the part when I was living at, going to Morehouse versus being in New York City now. Again, it's a work in progress. It's not about seeing any of those moments right now. It's about how will you look at all of those moments in the future and really construct and deconstruct that narrative. That, I would like to say, is what I want to offer to other artists. So they don't self-pigeonhole themselves into making that one body of work and saying, this is my totality. And not giving them the self to flex one way or the other from that. And I'm not denigrating anybody who works in one single chamber. That's totally fine if that's their way. But I think there's forces outside of the studio that want to keep artists in one specific box because they can maximize and profit off of it. Or they can control the narratives coming out of that box. And we artists sometimes fall into that because we're told that's how you make it. But we all know that art is it's an unwieldy beast. It does not follow rules. It shouldn't follow rules. Creativity does not work that way. Children know it. We don't. So my creative schizophrenia is actually, there's a method to my madness.
That's beautiful.
I'd like to know what motivated you, first of all, to move to Japan when you did, and then what your time there in Japan was like. And then the decision to go from there to graduate school, because we were at MFA programs at School of Art Institute of Chicago. We overlapped by 1 year. You don't know me, you wouldn't know that. But you just said, you just said it when you were there, so I know we overlapped by, your last year was, I think, yeah, your last year was my first year.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'd like to hear about that, and also, I know that's a bunch of stuff, but I'd like to also, do you speak Japanese?
Hi. Nihongo wo karimasu, nihongo shabaremasu. So the decision to move to Japan. Okay, so I was at Morehouse College, and at that time, Morehouse did not really have an active art department. So I took the majority of my art classes at Spelman across the street, and which had its benefits, obviously. If you know, you know. But I was also, the benefit of being one of the only dedicated artists at that time was that the instructors saw it, and they were like, we're going to take you out and put you into contests, and we're going to get you an apprenticeship over here. So they treated me like a young professional, and they ran me through the paces. Okay, so by the time I graduated from I spent my junior year in Italy, studying Italian and sculpture and painting and so on. Came back, graduated, and I had the travel bug and wanted to go someplace. And I had a couple of friends of mine from Morehouse who did their junior years at different places. We all talked. Japan seemed like the most interesting one. And there was a teaching program that paid like $65,000 tax-free, right out of undergrad. This is eons ago where that went a long way. So I applied and went to Japan, and I was there for 3 years, fell in love with it, loved being out of the US, loved being able to see the US from a very different lens, loved being in a place that was not Europe, because we weren't hearing a lot about Japan back then, except the bubble economy made people start to pay attention. But other than that, you were learning about Europe. So this was another way to sort of flesh out the worldview, right? So when I came back, I was sort of in the wilderness for a couple of years trying to figure out what to do. I moved back to LA. I was doing music, doing art, but really didn't have much direction until I met Vernette Honeywood, who also was a Spelman alum, and she started taking me around and introducing me to Samela Lewis and a lot of very, very important Black artists from a generation or two above me, or a generation or three above me, basically, at that point. And they introduced me to Dr. Leslie King Hammond, who was doing, she was the head of the graduate school at MICA in Baltimore. So I did a post-bac, because not coming from a real formal art education, there were lots of gaps in contemporary art history and materials and so on. So I did a post-bac for a year. After that, I was accepted to the Art Institute of Chicago. So that's a real technical breakdown of how I ended up there. But I had 7 years between undergrad and grad school, which I do not regret, because I appreciated grad school and knew what I wanted from it by the time I got there.
Yeah. I think that, one more question? Anybody? Good.
Hi, I just want to thank you for coming. It's so mind expanding. My question has to do with music. So I'm very interested to know who your foundational musical influences were, because if you have a hip hop perspective from the West Coast, my icon was Eric B. and Rakim. So I'm very interested to know who is your inspiration. I know his was Coltrane, so I'm looking to see artistry in that.
Man, we have another 45 minutes? Okay, I'm just gonna just word salad this really quickly, but check out that playlist that I mentioned, and a lot of this will make sense. At the home, it was Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, Mahalia Jackson. By the time I was in junior high school, it was Led Zeppelin, The Police, and the Smiths and the Cure. Eric B. and Rakim, let's see. I was going to summer school because I failed geometry and I had to go to summer school, and me and my friend ditched that day because we heard this new album was coming out from New York. We ditched summer school, got the cassette, and parked in a parking lot and listened to that cassette the entire day, over and over and over and over and over again. This is a seminal album that changed the whole cadence of rap. Rap wouldn't be what we know it if it weren't for this album. This is when the nursery rhymes were put aside, and now we're going to complex, polyrhythms and so on. So Eric B. and Rakim for sure. Coltrane, very early age. When I started doing those portraits as a high schooler, I was doing portraits of Jimi Hendrix, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, and Thelonious Monk. So that was very deep for my high school years. And the foundation bedrock of all of that and beyond, Prince.
Yeah, my brother worked for him.
Really?
Yeah. I'm from Minneapolis originally. Well, I don't know why we needed that information at the end of this, but anyway, well, we're having a conversation. So I just want to thank everybody for being here. Thank the Black Alumni Network for making this event possible. And moreover, thank you, Sanford, for being in Rochester Day and Memorial Art Gallery, as well as for the piece that gets to live with us. Thank you.
Thank you all.